Pravda isn't just the title of the most important Soviet newspaper. The Russian word Pravda means truth. Now, even though everything we suppose we know about the Soviet system would incite us to think that everything written in that paper is sheer lie, it isn't the case. Pravda almost never lies. It almost never distorts facts. Pravda lies by distortion, by omission of important facts, by concentrating on the lofty successes of communist construction, and by letting known very important failures and mistakes between the lines. It was founded in 1912, and it is the daily of the Central Committee of the Communist Party. It speaks entirely in its name, even though many of its articles are signed by professional journalists or totally unknown party bureaucrats. Pravda has a circulation of some 11 million copies, and with that, it is the largest newspaper in the world. The greatest European, American, or Japanese newspapers don't have a circulation of more than 700,000 copies, and even the People's Daily, the Chinese equivalent of Pravda, has a circulation that's somewhat less than 6 million. Notwithstanding this very wide circulation, it is only a very limited number of Pravda copies that are really read by a limited number of people. The average Soviet citizen isn't very much interested in party propaganda. He has of it quite enough through other medias and channels, including the regular meetings he has to attend at his or her workplace. So he or she is just skimming Pravda through in order to get a general picture about the main themes of propaganda, and he or she will read carefully between the lines, looking for omissions. The most important body of readers of Pravda is constituted of medium and low-level bureaucrats, officials in the party and state apparatus, whose number is about 400,000. They do read Pravda very carefully every day, because one of the most interesting features of this daily is that it is taking position on their work on a daily basis. It's indicating how do they handle the delicate relationships between the regime and society at one hand, and the complicated web of conflicts and tensions within the party and state apparatus. The majority of these professional readers of Pravda, who happen to be officials themselves, necessarily have access to classified information. But this information comes through the channels of their specific bodies, hierarchies, institutions, to the effect that they are distorted by the bias of the group or sectorial interest these bodies or organizations represent. In order to advance their career, they must have a hunch about everything going on in the Central Committee, and their best source of information is just its daily newspaper. So Pravda is first and foremost a kind of house organ for the party and state apparatus. And from this point of view, its most interesting materials contain valuable information for officialdom and indicate the evolution of the political line of the Central Committee concerning cadres and their work. And since their work touches upon almost every important aspect of daily life, you can surmise that through a careful reading of this paper, you can get a pretty realistic image about things happening in the Soviet Union Even though it would be vain to expect Pravda to give an exhaustive list of all the problems and issues bothering Soviet society and the Soviet political system. Of course, to read Pravda this way is just one possibility. You can read it for the foreign news. It carries 2 or 3 of its 6 to 8 pages are devoted to them, and so you can get a more or less clear image about the Kremlin's stand on most of world events. Or you can read it for economic news. Pravda's discourse is very heavily economic, but the most interesting thing you'll get from it won't be just about economic facts. It will be about the implementation or sabotage of Central Committee economic policies by lower level bureaucrats. Just like in this issue of the 10th March, we are going to read in some detail, which begins with an editorial about the necessity to increase efficiency in the Soviet economy. The experienced Soviet reader, and especially the cadre, won't begin with the first lines of this long article, because he knows already that the most interesting things will come somewhere here. It is here that the strictures are delivered. In this particular occasion, about the personal responsibility of medium and lower level cadres for efficiency in the economy and for waste that is towering in the Soviet economy. On some other occasions, instead of an editorial, a Central Committee decree can be printed, and it must be read and studied very carefully in most of cases, because it can indicate a lot of interesting aspects of the official line. If the editorial deals just with a holiday, an official holiday, or with the struggle for peace, you can skim it without scruples. It will repeat the most uninteresting commonplaces. But if it carries something in its title, like this one, which questions the right of some officials to lead the Soviet people, it must be read very carefully. Indeed, this leading article speaks about corruption and against inefficiency in Soviet economic and even political administration, and it gives a hard time for its readers. Now, on the first page, you don't have many interesting things. Portraits of model workers, the best news about economic successes, the decree convening the next session of the Supreme Soviet, and just down on the bottom of the page, a couple of lines about US schemes in Lebanon. But the next page is a crucial one for party officials and of all cadres in the Soviet state apparatus. It is the page where most of problems related to their work are discussed. On the top of it, very often low-level officials express their devoteness to the general line and take side on important economic or political issues. Sometimes, like in this one, a local party secretary would lobby for more funds or would explain that his difficulties are really great because he lacks this or that, but he'll do his best next year. There is a very specific genre in the Soviet press, and in Pravda especially. It's about the workings of the party apparatus. And in this March 10th issue, in this article, you can have a very clear idea about it. because it speaks about corruption. It is a follow-up story to one printed in '82 already, and in which the family circle, the nepotism of the leadership of a not very important city in the Bashkir Republic was depicted. More than 2 years later, it turns out that corruption is running as high as it used to be back in the old days. Corrupt or inefficient cadres are just given a party reprimand, and they are put in other leading jobs a couple of months later. And this is the thing Pravda is criticizing. No, at first hand, you would read it as a very tough warning. But for the professional reader of Pravda, it indicates a hell of a lot of things. The professional reader, the cadre, can surmise from the fact that it deals just with a not very important city in a not very important republic, that things aren't as hard as that. Finally, on the basis of this article, you can't say that too much folks would be punished. Maybe there will be another follow-up story under this headline, which means after criticism, and which states that after Pravda's tough article against this or that, some officials got really punished. But even there, you must differentiate very much. If the punishment was handed down by local or regional bodies, it won't be very hard. The hardest punishments are given by the Central Committee and its Control Commission, and they mean destitution, going on pension, or sometimes even being kicked out from the party, which is a pretty tough punishment for tenured bureaucrats. Now, on the second page too, very often you have some cheerful news for the average citizen. In this case, you have the one that new stereo sets are produced by a factory, which are shown here. Well, if you are lucky enough, you can spot them in the store and buy them, but you can never be sure that you'll really see it before long. On the second page, which deals with internal policy and with related matters, on this day of March 10th, you have a long celebration of Gagarin, the first man in space, a Soviet cosmonaut who was launched on orbit in 1961. He was very young at that time, and this article reports on a specific festivity staged for his 50th birthday. The only thing this article doesn't state, but Soviet citizens know it, is that Gagarin happened to die at the age of 34 in an air crash. It was in 1968. And, well, it's the specific style of Pravda, which isn't very fond of reporting bad news. For the Soviet citizen, the most interesting aspect of this article will be a summary of a speech of the Supreme Commander of the Soviet Air Force, which is very tough against the West, and which doesn't promise too much good things for the average Soviet citizen, because whenever Soviet marshals are tough on war danger, it means more investment in war equipment and less in vital things like housing or education, just like in any other country in the world. In this other article, a very typical one for Pravda, a Ukrainian writer is complaining about the waste of time officials, bureaucrats, and simple Soviet citizens are indulging in. and it exhorts them to care much more about their time, their work time especially, and that of the others. And it even repeats several times the old capitalist stricture, time is money. Now, as for the next pages, the next 2 pages are devoted to international events. Page 4 is normally devoted to things closely related to the Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc, and so is the top left corner of page 5. The rest of page 5 is thundering against imperialism. Nevertheless, it is an issue of Saturday, and on Saturdays you have the long Pravda commentary about the international situation here on the right side of page 4, which doesn't teach you too much, but you can get the impression on its basis that Soviet military spending won't be lowered if the tensions are to be maintained. For the average Soviet citizen who has a certain admiration for Western technical or cultural achievements, it conveys the feeling that the arms race is a pretty bad thing, and that he's one of the main victims of it. He doesn't bother about those who had initiated it in a more or less distant past. And the only thing he is really concerned about is that his housing won't be improved for many years, that Soviet agriculture, which is very inefficient, won't get more funds, and things like that. Now, on this page you have a very interesting article about the 60th anniversary of diplomatic relations between Norway and the Soviet Union. The experienced reader of Pravda will notice in it that the only Norwegian institution that is quoted in these articles as having celebrated this high holiday was the Norwegian Communist Party. And he'll surmise of it that there are some problems between Norway and the Soviet Union. Indeed, quite recently, highly ranked Norwegian foreign ministry official admitted of having given out state secrets to the Soviets in order to improve his finances, and it is cooling down Norwegian-Soviet relationships a little bit. Here on page 5, a Soviet airliner is shown, which it was given to Laos, supposedly as a gift. Now, Soviet citizens don't like too much these gifts because the whole set of expenditures the Soviet government is undertaking in order to enlarge its foothold abroad is a very heavy punction on everything he or she can get as services, consumer goods, or housing. Nevertheless, it is for attentive readers who can notice that it is an old Antonov 24 airliner, which isn't on service anymore within the Soviet Union. So it's just scrapped old airplane, and it can be sent to Laos without any specific harm to Soviet interests. Here you have an interesting, or two interesting articles, one about terror and terrorism in Salvador, something of the stuff you can read in the New York Times, and here with a cartoon about the Reagan administration's warmongering. The cartoon shows a spider composed of the Pentagon and the Congress building. Well, it's a very specific iconography Pravda cultivates, and which has a very long tradition. Soviet leaders notice the tendency at once, and they make up their mind about it. Notwithstanding all the things written on this page, it is this small news item which happens to be the most important and most interesting for Soviet citizens. It reports that a new complete edition of Lenin's works is to be put out in China. They aren't very much used to this kind of news. Usually, the bottom right corner of Pravda has been the place where the Peking leadership used to be scolded and denounced for the last 20 years. So it indicates a sensible improvement in relationships between the two countries. The last page, here you have the TV program, some beautiful pictures on folk dancers who are a very important part of official Soviet culture. So very often they are amateurs and they are cultivating their local popular traditions. Here you have some poems. Soviet poets are very keen on publishing some of their poetry in Pravda. It isn't their best poetry, but to be in Pravda means that you can publish something more interesting elsewhere. Here something about football, here about ecology, a very important Soviet concern, and about fishing. And here you don't have it now. Here and in this corner used to be announced the rotation of ambassadors, and sometimes very important news about which Moscow gossip is hard and which must be spelled out to the average Soviet citizen. In 1974, for instance, it was announced in this corner that Solzhenitsyn happened to be exiled. But very often, when the Moscow gossip machine is turning high, you must scrutinize the paper because some indications will be hidden. For instance, in January 1969, when Moscow rumor had it that an attempt was had been undertaken on the life of Soviet leaders, a couple of days later, in this hidden corner of page 3, you had official confirmation of the fact. So Pravda must be read pretty carefully. It isn't full truth, but show me a newspaper in the world which would carry it. It is just a pretty small part of it. But if you read it carefully, if you try to read between the lines, you can get a more or less exact picture, at least about things bothering the Moscow leadership. And that must be enough, I suppose, if you want to get a more or less clear picture about things happening in the Soviet Union.
Поди пишет самой лучшей девушке своей. Если писем не получишь, сообщи скорей. Если есть в письме ошибки, дело не хитро. Здесь чернила очень липкие, очень скверное перо. It's a long way to Tipperary. It's a long way to go. It's a long way to Tipperary. The sweetest girl I know. Oh, I think I need it. It's a long, long way to Tipperary. But my life. When he wrote a letter to his Irish Molly home, saying should do not receive it right, let me know. If I make mistakes in spelling, Molly lives that he remember it's the pen that's bad, don't lay the blame on me. It's a long way.
Добрый вечер.
Здравствуйте, товарищи. Сегодня в Москве, в Большом Кремлевском дворце, состоялось торжественное заседание, посвященное 80-летию создания Ленинской партии. Продолжительными аплодисментами встретили участники торжественного заседания товарищей Алиева, Горбачева, Романова, Устинова, Воротникова, Пономарева, Земянина, Русакова, Рыжкова. Вместе с ними генеральный секретарь ЦК Коммунистической партии Вьетнама, товарищ Язуан, генеральный секретарь ЦК Монгольской народно-революционной партии, председательской партии, руководители партийных, советских и общественных организаций, передовики и промышленников.